Hi, everybody. I'm Peter Yeo. I'm president of the Better World campaign, and welcome to this afternoon's session about how tech is pushing advocacy to go global. And this is the juxtaposition between the previous panel and this one is strong, but there is a connection here, which is basically how do we ensure that digital and social media can be used not only here in the United States to get better policy outcomes, but how it can be used in the global affairs arena as well. We at the Better World campaign are committed to using digital and social media to make it easier for millions of Americans to interact with their policymakers in support of better policy outcomes. And the reason why they can connect with their policymakers is you can do it via your phone. And being an advocate in support of the United Nations is, from our perspective, an important cause. Because when you look at what United Nations peacekeepers are doing in South Sudan to protect civilians, what United Nations agencies are doing in humanitarian crises, including Nepal, to help people, and when you look at what the United Nations does in the Security Council on the important national security issues that are affecting America, that these are issues that Americans want to be involved in and want to work with other countries. So in that context, digital has a real transformative impact. The best way to think about it from our perspective as an American advocacy organization is digital and social media is a gateway drug. It allows people easily to contact their members of Congress, to tweet, to post, to share, to tell their neighbors what they think. And once people become more comfortable using their voice in support of the UN and in support of global health issues, including vaccinations and malaria prevention and adolescent girl issues in the developing world, it's easier to work with Americans to take them to the next level in advocacy. How do you do lobby days? How do you arrange for in-district congressional meetings? How do you arrange phone calls? Because these higher levels of advocacy have a tremendous impact on policymakers. So it's the digital coming together with these higher forms of more complex forms of advocacy that come all together to actually make it easier for Americans to have a conversation with their policymakers and hopefully a long-term relationship to make sure that their work actually comes to fruition. And so as we think about empowering Americans, it's really just a microcosm of advocacy in the global space. When you think about how do you give voices to rural villagers who don't get the services they need for their community, they need to be advocates for themselves. Digital and social media is an important element of that. When you think about governments who want to make sure that there's voice to their values, voice to what they care about, digital and social media is a crucial element of their communication strategy moving forward. And when you think about how do you make advocates the most effective they can be, a lot of it is making sure they have the data, that they come across as smart advocates, they know what they're talking about, and digital and social media is really crucial to making this whole equation happen, to taking digital from the US and ensuring that technology and digital impacts advocacy everywhere around the world. And we're really fortunate to have with us this afternoon two leaders in this field who really know what the heck they're talking about and can educate us. Tariq Khokhar is the data scientist of the World Bank and the institution's open data evangelist. And Moira Whelan is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Digital Strategy. So I'm going to open it up with some questions and get the dialogue going, and then we'll see where we go from there. For both of our panelists today, ripped from a headlines approach, you look at what's happening in Nepal, you look at what's happening with Syrian refugees, and you look at what's happening in urban communities around the world, whether it's in Europe or US, where people feel disaffected and don't feel connected with the people that are making the decisions that affect their lives. How can social media, how can the digital platforms, how can they have an impact on better outcomes?
Well, thanks for having us here today, and I think these conversations are important for a lot of what you're talking about. I think we see every day in the United States that we're getting more and more used to having a two-way conversation with our representatives, with our congressmen, and we don't necessarily see that in a lot of the world. We're seeing digital become the equalizer for a lot of us to be able to help each other, to have conversations, to grow movements, and also a growing expectation on a lot of institutions to open their doors a bit more, to show people how we do the work that we do, and also to answer questions and sort of demystify a lot of the decision making that's happening in their name. I think when you look at something like Nepal or any of the crises that we see, one of the great developments that we really like right now is MapGive, programs like that allow people to help and assist, not just with money and not just with the giving campaigns, but with actual action. And we saw different forms of that with Ebola, the action people were taking to identify where the outbreak was happening, and that was a game changer for the people on the ground who were doing the work. When it comes to people who are feeling disaffected, listen, I think we have to be honest and say that these conversations, the ones we've grown used to, are not necessarily the norm in the world today. That governments interacting with their people through social media is something we still have to advocate for as a subject matter, because we're not totally there yet. Not everyone is bought on to this idea that being more open about the way we do business is the best way to go about things for the interest of the people and the country. So we try to spend a lot of our time walking the walk and being live as much as we can, being out there and being open about anything from a daily schedule to showing what a back room of a meeting looks like. And we just try to demonstrate not only to people that we want to show them what's happening, but to bring them into a conversation, and to democratize that a lot more by allowing our embassies and our ambassadors and all of our representatives to really speak for themselves, to show that we're willing to show up in these tough conversations.
Great. Tariq?
So again, thanks very much for having me. So this year is the 5 years since the World Bank went from closed to open. So I'm also think this has been on my mind a lot lately. So from the institution's perspective, I think the change in the way we use digital technologies and our kind of open by default approach, the main effect has been we sort of let our hair down a bit. And normally you think of an institution like the World Bank, you think of a guy wearing a darker colored suit and probably a tie as well. And for most of my colleagues, that is probably still the case. But there is a significant minority of us who sort of, I feel like we fundamentally changed the way we work, and we fundamentally changed the way we kind of interact with the outside world. I probably shouldn't draw attention to the fact that during the bank's spring meetings and annual meetings, if you came 7 or 8 years ago, you would have seen quite a few people gathered outside protesting against the World Bank. If you visited us during the spring meetings this year, you would have noticed a conspicuous absence of those people protesting outside the World Bank. Where did they go? They came inside the World Bank. So we decided to have a kind of open forum. So all the people who had issues previously, we just opened the discussion up to kind of involve them more closely. So from the institution's perspective, I feel like it's changed the sort of fabric of the place a bit. And in terms of the outside world, I feel like digital tools allow us to be way nerdier than we used to be. So my job title is data scientist, and you can probably guess that I'm a little bit nerdy and not kind of used to doing this kind of thing. And usually when we were told to communicate about our work or explain what we do, we have to sort of package it in sort of friendly ways and make it engaging to big audiences. We do that as well, but we can now be mega nerdy as well. So we have, we have tumblers dedicated to data visualization. We publish source code and analyses, and we can actually have a conversation with people who are technically interested in the very fine details of what we're doing. And for me personally, I think that's one of the biggest changes. We can really engage on a way deeper level than we used to.
Well, you've raised an interesting issue, which is you both work for large institutions that have been around for quite a while. What are the institutional barriers to sort of embracing digital platforms as part of the solution, because there's perhaps a tendency sometimes to feel that most of these issues can be dealt with diplomacy or through other forms of more traditional management tools or diplomatic tools. How do you arrive at the right tipping point where you're not barking to be at the door and they're calling and saying, just to be clear, if we're going to achieve this policy outcome, we've got to make sure that there's a social media component, digital platforms are being utilized in achieving this outcome?
Well, I think you touch on something interesting that we're dealing with every day at State. I think in terms of how we do our work to a general public, we really have embraced this idea of social media and digital. Everybody's out there, everybody's having that conversation. But it's not a substitute for the in real life, right? John Kerry still travels more than any other secretary we've ever had. He's also the first secretary to tweet. So we're on that, it's a natural extension of the public diplomacy work we've done for a really long time. On the other side, in terms of how we do business, we're still learning. We're getting better. It's a word-based building. You see cables. Everyone's heard about State Department cables. The idea of including a picture in the cable process is actually pretty onerous. Even a map. I realize that's crazy, right? You should be able to attach a map. We're still working through that. And we recently had the QDDR, the Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review, where we really made this a priority. And we're trying to figure out ways to work better and work smarter. Not only to produce it for ourselves in our own work, but with the general intention that we would make this available so that our colleagues around the world, our colleagues in other agencies, can use the information we have to do better. And I think we have to be honest about that, right? That we're not doing everything as well as we could, and we have to seek input from other organizations, maybe the World Bank, if you guys want to come over and tell us. But seek information about how we can do it better.
Great.
So.
Tara?
So the tipping point in the institution for adoption of these kinds of tools in various aspects of our work, it seems to vary wildly in my experience. You guys may have seen the bank's president yesterday join Twitter, and you'd think the president of the World Bank would already be on Twitter, but he kind of wasn't. I think it's great that he is now, but it kind of took a while to get there. So in spite of the organization being very digitally literate, there's still lots of kind of work to do. In terms of our work, we're kind of we do stuff that is often not very photogenic, and it's not that easy to communicate about. So one of the biggest hurdles is to kind of try and tell the story about what exactly the World Bank is doing, and try and make the people who are doing it give them the tools to show what's going on. So that for me, that's the kind of key. The tipping point is really when you can give someone an outlet to show something that they're proud of and show the kind of results that they're achieving. They really gravitate towards that. So Instagram was this kind of bizarre success for the World Bank. I never thought that the World Bank would have an Instagram account, but it's amazing because you see visually. Just simple things like if you're working on an education project, what do you think of when you think of an education project? You think of schools, right? So you see a picture of a place where there was no school and a picture where there was a school. That's a very compelling visual, and the people who are involved in that work are sort of very, very proud of that. But I think that as more and more individuals in the organization use these tools for these kinds of things, I think there's a sort of pleasant network effect that encourages others to do it as well.
Well, and to what extent are the President of the World Bank, the Secretary of State, and the senior leadership, when people are expressing their views via social media, when they're tweeting, at the Secretary of State, they're engaging in a variety of grassroots campaigns designed to influence the State Department or the World Bank. How do you internally institutionalize a system that those views are fed up and that there's not a block, that people are out there sort of expressing their views and the policymakers are doing what they want? How internally do you ensure that this passion comes through?
I think one of the ways we address it, because that's a daily challenge for us, right? We're talking to the United States, we're also talking to the whole world on every issue you can imagine, in every language. So trying to do that in an organized way and trying to make sure all of that information gets where it needs to go is a challenge. So the first thing we do is sort of let everybody get out there and have those conversations themselves. That's going to be the best way to make sure that feedback loop is in place, is if an ambassador, if a deputy assistant secretary, a special envoy are actually out there putting up Instagram pictures or on Facebook or on Twitter and hearing from the people that are interested in hearing from them. We don't even have to touch that one, and we see a lot of impact. When we talk about the tipping point, that's where people who, geek out on whatever small issue that the State Department might be dealing with that's really important, start hearing from thousands of people that are following their every word and taking them, interested in everything they have to say. So that's one way. The other way, we try to create these engagement events. We have a rule that we try to do an event at least once a week. That can be anything from a Q&A. We did a Reddit AMA with our Cuba sanctions people last week. And, that was great, right? Like, I do Cuba sanctions, ask me anything. And we try to do things like that at least once a week on any range of issues. Google Hangouts. We've done, we try all sorts of new things. So that's one rule we try to put in place to make sure that we're not stuck in broadcast mode, but we're actually in exchange mode. Because we feel like from headquarters, that's a really important example to set for our embassies. To us, again, it's walking the walk. That's what we believe in. That's our message around the world, is that we believe in participatory democracy, and we want people to be involved in the conversations about their country and their world. So we've got to do it, and we have to live that. So it can be a challenge, but we've got to try.
Yeah, and we take a very similar approach. I think the bank's people who are involved in external affairs, they provide some lightweight guidelines for staff saying, you are encouraged to use social media to talk about your work. Here's like 10 things you should probably know before you go and do this, but have at it. That's the kind of general attitude. And I think that works. It works really well. When it comes to sort of very high volume accounts or high profile individuals, I'm not entirely sure how it works. But I know that this morning Jim was tweeting in Korean, which I'm pretty sure that nobody in the external affairs knows what he's saying. So
who knows what was said? Well, including the U.S. ambassador to South Korea frequently tweets in Korean as well, so they can tweet at each other. Talk to me more about how do you empower the use of social media, the use of digital platforms in some of the poorest communities around the world? Because when you think about whether it's human rights issues, economic development issues, extreme poverty, and the fact that particularly in Africa, you've seen the whole landline generation just skipped over in terms of the proliferation of mobile. How do we facilitate the use of social media for people to be able to express their views to their policymakers, and yet at the same time, as Americans or as international diplomats, not be in the situation where we're guiding the conversation?
Well, I think the first big challenge that we spend time getting over is the belief that people still have that these communities aren't connected. Yeah. And the example I've used over the past couple of weeks in several spaces is that Somalia now has 3G. And that's where we are. That's the world we live in. And as you say, we've jumped over that. Buttoned up diplomats don't always, know that as a first step, that those conversations are happening and that they should be a part of them. We have faced at times when our government, when our actions abroad as a U.S. government has gotten ahead of our host government in terms of how comfortable they are in the space. What we've tried to do in those spaces is bring them along. A few of us have been enlisted to sort of go to countries where that's happening and say, this isn't a scary environment. You can be criticized and you can respond, or you can open yourself up to these conversations because it's going to make you stronger as a government. We're watching, and again, for us, it's about being authentically American and being who we are. We're not going to curb our outreach to people because the government that we're working in may not be able to keep up with us. For the most part, they're pretty open to it. They just need help along the way. There are tough environments that all of our diplomats are working in, and they've really got to use their judgment. And that's probably the biggest thing we do is trust that just as they wear the State Department brand, whether they're sitting on a stage or whether they're tweeting, and we've got to trust them to be on the right platforms, to be on the right stages, and to speak openly about their position. They represent us. Why not on the internet as much as they do in person?
And Tariq, what can the bank do to make sure that people around the world actually have access to these platforms? I mean, as you think about what the World Bank projects are and how you use your resources, what can you do to make sure that the transformative impact of digital goes as far as possible?
I mean, honestly, the most important thing we can do is dig massive trenches in the sea and lay cables. So undersea internet cable infrastructure is one of the most important things I think the World Bank finances that I guess people don't know about. But yeah, we've dug holes in seas and put wires there so that countries get connected. But on the other side, I don't think citizens in developing countries need much help in terms of getting online or in terms of accessing social media. I think something like half of our social media audience is coming from countries outside North America and Europe. So there's already folks there. I mean, if anything, I feel like it's governments in the countries where we work who aren't necessarily equipped to listen. So, I mean, I know that Washington is the center of the universe, and I know that the red line being broken is exactly why you need to tweet to WMATA. But that is not a first world problem. I mean, folks in Lagos are going to be tweeting saying, "Oh my God, this bridge is screwed again," or exactly the same stuff happens. So, but I think that many of those governments don't necessarily have the listening tools or the setup to kind of handle that. So there's no sort of see-click fix in Abuja, and there's no citizen feedback or service delivery feedback platform that's generally used out there. And to be honest, they're not really that well done in North America either. But that's kind of where I think the World Bank can help. We kind of work with governments to try and listen to citizens better so they can improve the sort of delivery of the services they're kind of accountable for.
And there's been a lot of discussion today and coming up about sort of what's coming next in terms of the use of technology, the use of digital platforms. As you think about 5 years from now, what are your institutions going to be working on to increase access, to ensure that social media and digital platforms are even more utilized than they are today? Can you give us some examples of either best practices that you hope to institute or technologies that you think are coming down the line that you think that's going to be useful?
Well, I think everyone is starting to get tired of me saying this, but I think, and he didn't pay me to say this, but I do think Meerkat, Periscope, the live video element, the democratization of broadcast is really going to be a game changer in a lot of ways for diplomacy. It started as simple as, we had a principal getting ready to do a Twitter Q&A when Periscope launched, and it's like, can you really do a Twitter Q&A anymore behind a keyboard? Shouldn't you just Periscope the whole thing? So it starts as simple as that and up to something much more real and complicated, which is bearing witness to violence and atrocities around the world in real time, bringing people into these conflicts as we see them. That's going to drive policy action to happen a lot faster than a taped video where people can then say, oh, that was doctored or that's only a small representation, but really having people be part of those experiences that people are having around the world, both positive and negative. And I think we have to prepare for that and prepare for how we're going to act as governments to remain credible and authentic in that conversation as we all start to see the world through each other's eyes in a much more real way.
Yeah. So I can speak to what I hope will happen rather than what I think will happen. What I hope will happen is that people will start to think of data as a first-class object, and they will start to think of themselves as sort of censors who own the data that they produce. So right now, everyone here is holding a mobile phone. Everyone here is generating metadata, whether you like it or not. And people are using that for selling you stuff, for eventually they're going to be using it for proxying official statistics by the government. They're going to be using it as part of emergency response, all these kinds of things. But there's also things like Apple's Research Kit, which is using data you generate for large-scale medical testing. There are other sort of data collection activities that happen using cell phones that are fundamentally going to inform the way governments think about society and how society thinks about itself. So what I hope will happen is that your relationship with the data that you produce and generate will change, and it will change for the better. You will explicitly have control over it. And once you do that, I think globally, suddenly your data is something that kind of unites everyone. Everyone is a human sensor. Everyone is producing information about the world around them themselves, and for me, it has this kind of weirdly unifying feeling. So there you go. That's what I hope will happen.
That's a good hope, and I think it's vitally important that not only is the data generated, but that the data is effectively utilized by policymakers, because I think there's a whole series of new streams of data coming online, and we've got to make sure it's utilized. So, well, we're out of time, but please join me in thanking both Tariq and Moira for elucidating their viewpoint today and making us all smart about how digital is changing the face of advocacy around the world. So thank you very much.